Hey guys, it's Robbie from Motec. Today we're going to talk a little bit about suspension on your JK. When you have 200 horsepower in a JK and then you put a V8 in it and you have 400 horsepower, it can exaggerate any suspension problems you have. So we're going to look at some of the most common suspension problems and or areas that you should be concerned about. Alright, so here we have a late model JK on the rack with Metal Cloak Game Changer suspension. This has Fusion 4x4 axles, but it doesn't really matter what kind of axles and suspension you have. The principles we're going to talk about pretty much apply to all JKs. These vehicles have live axles, which mean they're not like independent suspension. So let's start up here in the front. Now you can see that this vehicle does have hydraulic steering. Basically what that means is we replace the steering stabilizer with a hydraulic cylinder. And that allows you to use the steering gear, which is up here, as a control valve, like the old Corvettes and Fords did, to control this ram and act directly on the tie rod to move your tires back and forth. Now, a lot of you guys have the Heavy Duty XD box, and what that does is it transfers the power through the drag link to the spindle and then through the tie rod. So that's a step down from an actual hydraulic cylinder on the tie rod, which acts directly on the wheels rather than through a drag link. Now the geometry of these suspension systems is really critical. Let's start off with the basic geometry. First is wheelbase. Wheelbase is going to be the distance from the front tire to the rear tire, or more specifically from the center point of this axle to the center point of that axle. And they have to be exactly the same on both sides. If it's not, you're going to crab going down the road. If you have a problem with your wheelbase and you have stock control arms, the stock control arms are not adjustable. What that basically means is they're fixed points on the frame and the axle. So there's really no adjustment to control your wheelbase. There are cam adjusters and things, but the bottom line is if your wheelbase is off, you probably have something bent like an axle or a frame, and you have to have that looked into. Now premium suspension systems will come with adjustable control arms like these Game Changer arms. And there's several things you can do with these adjustable control arms. One on the front is we can control pinion angle. Basically by lengthening or shortening these arms, we can control the angle of the pinion. Next thing we're going to look at is our track. And the track is basically the distance between the two front tires and the two rear tires. Now in the rear, in general, the tires should be in alignment with each other or parallel. So as you go down the road, they both run at exactly the same angle. In the front, you're going to have something called toe-in. Now toe-in is adjustable by taking this tie rod and running it in and out. And you want to have a little bit of toe-in because it adds stability. Manufacturers rate toe-in not only by a measurement like inches or millimeters, but also by angle, like 1.6 degrees, etc. Toe-in can help your vehicle go down the road straight with less twitchiness on center. You don't want to run too much toe-in because that could lead to premature tire wear. Next, let's take a quick look at camber. Camber is not really something that you can adjust. It's pretty much built into your axle. There are some offset ball joints and things, but they're pretty oddball. And the manufacturer of your axle should know how much camber to run. But basically the top of the tire is angled in towards the vehicle, and that can help in cornering. The next thing I want to look at is caster, and caster is very important. Caster is basically laying back the spindle, and by putting negative caster into a vehicle, we get a better on-center feel, and that's what snaps your steering wheel back to center. Now we can adjust caster with these control arms. You can see these control arms are adjustable. So we can wind this one in. Let's say we take the upper and we shorten it, or we take the lower and we lengthen it. We can roll back this spindle and get negative camber. You want to run 4 to 6 degrees in my opinion to get a good on-center feel with these larger tires. But here's a problem. There's something called a separation angle, and if we wind too much negative caster in and we roll this pinion down, now we're going to be increasing the angle or the steepness of this drive shaft. And if you go too far, you can have a vibration or premature wear in the drive shaft. The separation angle is basically the difference between this pinion angle and these brackets. And we want these leaf springs to be approximately vertical when the vehicle is on the ground at ride height. And we want this pinion angle to not be too excessive for the front drive shaft. So when you order a custom axle, it's best to know what lift you have, what transfer case you have, so that that front drive shaft angle is proper and all this bracketry stays in alignment where you want to have it. Having these adjustable control arms helps a lot because we can fine-tune things by rolling this axle back and forth. We can add more caster for a better on-center feel, but if our pinion angle is a little bit too steep, we can roll it back and compromise. Another thing you can do with adjustable control arms is when you lift a JK, it pulls the axles inward. So by going to a longer control arm, we push the tire back into the center of the wheel well. If you ran stock control arms, especially like on a two-door, it's going to pull those tires back and it's going to look goofy. Track bars essentially keep the axle centered in the frame. Now this vehicle has been raised up, and this track bar, just like the front, runs through an arc. So as this axle goes up and down, it's going to move left and right. When the vehicle is on the ground at ride height, you want these axles centered in the frame. As it goes up, it's going to pull one way, and as it goes down, it's going to pull the other way. Now, budget lifts are not going to come with an adjustable track bar like this. A lot of them come with offset brackets, which basically bolt onto your axle and try to put the track bar back where it was. But be very careful about that, because when that axle is at ride height, you want it to be in the center. If it's pulled over to one side or the other, you're putting a lot of stress on this bracket, and I've actually seen them break off on the trail. So if you can afford it, get yourself an adjustable track bar. It helps a lot. So essentially what we have here is a 5-link system. We got an upper control arm and a lower control arm on both sides. Then we got our track bar or panhard bar controlling the side-to-side movement of the axle. This live axle technology has been around for a long, long time. It's very rugged and it works well, but you got to make sure that it's set up properly. If you don't set it up properly, you're going to have issues. Go to the front and we'll talk about some of those issues. So let's take a basic look at the steering on this Jeep. As this axle goes up and down, a lot of things are happening. Here we have our steering gear. And this is our pitman arm. I hope you guys can see this. This pitman arm goes to a drag link. As you turn the steering wheel, this pitman arm is going to travel back and forth, and it's going to push on this spindle, which is then going to transfer the steering effort into this tie rod, and that's what's going to move your wheels back and forth. This ram is going to apply hydraulic force to this tie rod to assist you in steering. All this has to happen while the axle is going up and down, and you can imagine how complex that is. Now let's take a closer look at the geometry of how these components are working together. The tie rod is probably the simplest of all these components because it basically just ties the two spindles together. And as these tires go up and down, obviously there's going to be an angular change, so we have ball joints on this tie rod. This is a pretty beefy tie rod. It's also one that you're able to lubricate. Some of these are lube for life and you can't lubricate them, so if you do have Zerk fittings, make sure you keep those greased. Second is the drag link, and this drag link is an extremely important component, especially when you combine it with the track bar. This drag link and this track bar have a relationship, and you can see they're just about parallel in this application, which is pretty good. A lot of guys say you have to have them exactly parallel, but here's what's important. You can see this track bar has been attached to the axle at this point. This track bar is keeping the axle from moving left and right. We want this axle centered in the frame rails when we're at ride height. But the reality is this axle is going to go up and down. So as this axle goes up and down, this point is going to go through an arc and it's going to move left and right. Well, the relationship between that track bar and this drag link is critical. You can see that we have a low steer here, which basically means we have this drag link ball joint on the bottom side of the spindle. If this were on the top, a lot of guys call that the high steer. Here's the important part. We want the pivot point of where this drag link attaches to this spindle and where this track bar attaches to this axle to be in the same plane. And I'm talking about from the ground up to this point and to this point, this pivot point, need to be the same. Then, as this axle goes up and down, these are traveling in the same arc. If this track bar were mounted 3 inches higher, 3 inches lower, it's going to travel in a different arc than this drag link. And when you do that, what you're going to get is a torque input. And you can call it torque steer, you can call it brake steer when you press on the brakes hard and the front end dives down. or when you floor it and you change lanes. But the bottom line is you're going to have a steering input based on this axle going up and down because these 2 points are moving in separate arcs. And this is critical. If you do have a high steer, make sure you raise this track bar to match it. If you have a low steer and you have an aftermarket axle and your track bar is mounted way up high, get it down. Get these pivot points approximately in the same plane and you'll have less steering wheel input. And I'm saying this because when we get Jeeps in here with 200 horsepower and they don't really have a whole lot of power, you can floor them all you want, the front end doesn't come up that much. When you get 450 horsepower in a Jeep with crawler suspension that's really floppy and you floor it, this front end can drop 5, 6, 8 inches and you really feel that steering wheel input. So you want to make sure you get that geometry right. Now we're not going to go into suspension right now because there's a whole lot of technology there. We're just going to look at the basics. We had the wheelbase, our track, toe in, caster, camber, and most importantly is this relationship between our track bar and our drag link. Make sure that those are in the same plane and your Jeep should drive relatively straight down the road. Let's take a quick look at the sway bar so we can discuss the function of that. And basically what a sway bar does is it tries to keep the vehicle flat or level, especially when you're cornering. If you're cornering hard, this sway bar and this link can transfer the weight to the other side so the vehicle stays flat and it doesn't excessively roll. A lot of vehicles have disconnecting sway bars. Now you can see that these do not have quick disconnecting links because we have a Rubicon electronic sway bar. So we can disconnect this sway bar inside this unit, which will disengage this link from that link. What that does is if you're crawling and you want these wheels to move independent from each other, by disconnecting that sway bar you can get a better ride off-road. So disconnecting your sway bar at low speed can help you articulate over obstacles more easily if that sway bar was connected. We also have a sway bar in the rear. Sway bars really come down to what your use is. If you're going through the desert at 50 miles an hour pre-running versus crawling at low speed, the suspension has to be set up completely different. And we're not going to talk about that right now. We're just going to try to focus on the basics of keeping your JK going down the road safe and straight. So I'm going to wrap this video up right now, but we will come back and we'll discuss more about suspension systems and articulation, long arms versus mid arms, the advantages and disadvantages. Thanks.